In this lesson, we're going to move into the next step of our basic LBO model here, which is to look at some of the assumptions surrounding debt in this model. Now, previously in this course, wherever we've used debt, so for example, in the merger model right here, where we had a percent debt, and then we assumed a percent interest rate on the debt, the assumptions have been fairly simple and straightforward. So even going back to our three-step model here, where we assumed that Apple takes on $1 billion worth of debt in 2010 year, most of our assumptions have been fairly simple and straightforward. But with an LBO model, we have to go into a bit more detail on the topic of debt because it's so crucial to the model itself and to how private equity firms think about structuring the deal and ensuring that they actually get a good return on their investment. The most basic concept here, and one that we're going to address in this model before getting into a more advanced treatment in the next course on a more advanced LBO model, is that there are different types of debt. Previously, we had assumed that we just had one type that paid a fixed interest rate, but the reality is there are many different types of debt, and some of them are very risky and appeal to investors that have more of an appetite for risk, whereas others are very safe and appeal to investors that don't care that much about a high return, they just want some kind of safe investment. The way debt is usually divided is as we've done right here, bank debt and high yield debt. And these are really the two basic categories of debt that you look at in pretty much any type of merger model, any type of financing scenario. The basic differences here are that with bank debt, you tend to have lower interest rates, you have principal repayment, prepayment is allowed, and you have maintenance covenants. With high yield debt, by contrast, you tend to have higher interest rates, there is no principal repayment, there is no prepayment, and you have incurrence covenants. Now there are many differences beyond the ones that I've outlined here, but these are some of the most important ones for your purposes to understand in an LBO model. So with interest rates, this one's fairly self-explanatory. With bank debt, most of the investors here are going to be traditional banks, so they would rather earn lower interest and get a relatively safe return. High yield debt, by contrast, the investors are more like hedge funds, arbitrage funds, riskier types of investment firms, and so they're going to demand higher interest rates with the knowledge that the company may go bankrupt, they may lose much of their investment here. Principal repayment, so bank debt is very much like a mortgage or a car loan, for example, where you have to repay much of the principal over time. So if you take out $100,000 worth of debt, maybe 10% of that is due each year, maybe 20%. With high yield debt, by contrast, it's different, and you do not repay any of the principal. Instead, the entire debt balance is due at the end. So if you think about it, this makes it riskier for the company because instead of paying off some of the debt each year, they're just going to have to repay all 100,000 or all 100 million at the end of the period. With prepayment, so with bank debt, if you have enough cash saved up, have enough cash flow, you can actually prepay some of the loan. And so if you have extra money laying around, you can actually use it to pay off the debt. With high yield debt, by contrast, normally you cannot do that. And then the last one here has to do with covenants. So maintenance covenants refer to things like total debt over EBITDA, EBITDA to interest expense, and so on. So metrics like that that the company cannot exceed or go under. So whenever a bank loans a company money in a leveraged buyout, they'll specify conditions like this, and they'll say you cannot go above 3x debt to EBITDA, for example. With high yield debt, by contrast, the restrictions, the covenants on the debt are more of the form that you cannot spend over a certain amount on CapEx, you cannot make divestitures, so you can't sell parts of your company. So the restrictions are a bit different. And the reason, again, is because high yield debt tends to be riskier and has a higher rate of return, higher interest rates. Bank debt tends to be safer and has lower interest rates and overall makes it safer for the investor by having many of these restrictions and options in place. Again, there are other differences beyond the ones mentioned here, but these are the most important ones to understand for our purposes in this LBO model. So with knowledge of those two different types of debt in place, let's go about actually filling in some of our assumptions on debt now. So the first one here is figuring out what percent debt we're using. We've already defined this above, so I'm just going to link in from our transaction assumptions. Debt required, we've also calculated this one above, so I'm going to link in from there. Now for the bank debt percentage and high yield debt percentage, usually a company will use as much bank debt as it possibly can before it resorts to anything that has higher interest rates. In this case, to actually determine this, we would have to look at comparable companies, comparable debt issuances, but what I'm going to do to simplify this is just say 75% for bank debt, and then high yield debt will cover the remainder. So I'm going to say, once again, 1 minus the 75%. Now in dollar terms, what does this actually correspond to? Well, we have 75% right here times the debt required. So you have 79 billion worth of bank debt. And then high yield debt, we have the 25% times the debt required. So we have 26 or 27 billion worth of high yield debt. So the last set of assumptions here have to do with the interest rates and the principal repayments. Remember that for bank debt, interest rates tend to be lower than they are for high yield debt. So for the bank debt interest rate, I'm going to say 8%. For the high yield interest rate, I'm going to say 11%. And again, to actually get exact scientific numbers for these, we would go in and look at comparable debt issuances, comparable companies, and see what kind of interest rates on debt they have. So now for these last items here, for the principal repayment percentages, so these are both referring to how much of the original balance of the loan for bank debt and high yield debt actually gets repaid each year. Now remember that with bank debt, you actually are repaying some of the principal each year, whereas with high yield debt, you are not. Everything is due at the end, which is called bullet maturity. So for the bank debt, I'm going to enter in 10% right here. We're going to assume that this loan lasts for 10 years and 1/10 is paid off each year. For high yield debt, I'm going to enter 0% to reflect the fact that with high yield debt, nothing is actually being repaid each year and everything is due at the end instead. So with those last assumptions in place, we're pretty much done now with our treatment of debt, at least for this point in the model. Later on, we will be coming back to debt in detail and creating a debt and interest schedule that shows how these balances change over time and how interest is paid on debt and how interest is earned on cash. But for now, we're done with our debt assumptions. Coming up next, we're going to be creating a sources and uses schedule to tell us more accurately where the funding for this transaction is coming from and where it's going to.